This lecture is going to be a very, very brief overview of some feminist perspectives on science with an addendum toward the end on some postmodern perspectives on science. Now, this is going to be, unfortunately, a very, very cursory overview. You could do a whole course on feminist perspectives on science, and many people have, and likewise, postmodernism has an awful lot to say about science. I am not going to have anywhere near enough time to give anything like an exhaustive coverage of either of these topics. Both are worth looking into in more detail than what I'm going to give it here, but since I have been working on the series, I do want to make at least a couple of observations about how both of these approaches can take critical and informative looks at what science is and how it works. Starting with just, again, some general sort of historical background here. I've talked before in this course about the Enlightenment view of science, which was, again, this very optimistic picture of science, that it's going to just keep making the world a better place, that it sort of transcends politics, and that it empowers people to know things and to improve the quality of life. And fundamentally, it also has kind of this sort of disruptive nature to it. So it challenges things like the entrenched power of the church, and it can challenge entrenched political power, and it can sort of shed light, hence the Enlightenment, on the darkness of human civilization and human nature. Now, by this point in the course, if you've been following along, I hope it doesn't come as much of a surprise to sort of see that in the 20th century, this image kind of starts to be viewed as kind of naive. Feyerabend in previous lecture charged that science has become the entrenched power. It's become the church of yore, and is now instead actually lording over people a tremendous amount of control of their lives. A couple quick examples here. Think about the relationship between military power and science. A tremendous amount of funding from science actually does come from the military and therefore serves military purposes. Now, these things obviously can improve the general quality of life around the world and for people in a particular country, but it can also threaten that quality of life. And it's sort of, you have to sort of wonder whose interests fundamentally are served by this kind of scientific research. Is it the military? Is it the people in general? You can think about the kinds of concerns that George Orwell expressed in his novel 1984 about a surveillance society and about how it becomes impossible to have any kind of privacy, and how science empowers powerful interests to intrude into the daily lives of people in places that they frankly probably have, where other interests have no right to penetrate. And of course, you can also think about the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the tremendous destruction of life that ensued. If anything deflates the pretension that science is always going to make the world a better place, Hiroshima and Nagasaki probably sort of illustrate that better than any single event in the history of science ever could. Now, at any rate, the idea that science is apolitical, that it's governed fundamentally by epistemic values, it's only governed by the search for truth, that only cares fundamentally about following the evidence, at this point, I think it's not terribly controversial to say that this view is naive at best. We've been sort of seeing this view get criticized ever since the Kuhn lecture, several lectures back. And frankly, I don't think it's staying too hard to say that this is a myth. It's simply not the case that science is this apolitical, morally neutral, value-neutral discipline. That's just not the way that it works. But of course, even if we recognize that, even if we can sort of agree on that, it still leaves open the question of just how much of an influence on science comes from factors completely outside of science. In what ways is it fair to say that science is political? Again, is this something that's is it intrinsically political? Is this something that is sort of just a sort of an unavoidable byproduct of the fact that science is done by human beings in political contexts? And what is the relationship between these kinds of sources of political power and science itself? Now, stated thusly, of course, these are pretty generic questions, but I do want to look at these sort of broad questions from the point of view of feminist and postmodern perspectives in this lecture. Now, I want to say a little bit for starters about feminism, because this is a term that is notoriously difficult to pin down, and it means many different things to many, many different people. It's obviously a very broad-ranging term. It's an umbrella term that covers a wide collection of views regarding how it is that men and women relate to one another, and how we should even understand these categories of men and women. Now, there are so many different varieties of feminism that the label is a very, very difficult one to pin down. It's quite possible, actually, that there are no substantive, interesting views that are shared across the board by all people who adopt the label feminist. It's something that makes actually conversing about feminism actually rather difficult. The label feminist by itself probably should always come with a qualifier of some sort. There's first wave feminism, second wave feminism, third wave feminism. There's a whole variety of different kinds of feminism out there, and it's something that makes hard for having conversation if one person has an image of feminism in their mind and the other person has a different image. Neither of those images might be wrong, but they're just going to be different from one another, and that can cause lots of confusion and crosstalk. And unfortunately, it doesn't really get a whole heck of a lot easier if we're just talking about feminist perspectives on science. There are a wide variety of different feminist perspectives on science, in the same way that there's a wide variety of different feminist perspectives, period. Now, the most generic and hopefully least controversial definition of feminism that I know is something like this. Feminism is the belief that women are morally, politically, socially, economically, and epistemically equivalent to men. But even that definition isn't really going to be accepted by all feminists. There's a school of thought called difference feminism, which actually does sort of want to highlight and underscore the important and essential differences between men and women, and these may indeed be epistemic in some varieties. They may even be moral or political in some varieties. So even that definition, again, which is, I think, again, as generic as I can get, isn't without controversy. But I'm going to be more or less be assuming something kind of like this as just the background for this lecture, even though it's, again, I think this statement is not terribly interesting nor terribly helpful. And hopefully the differences between the different flavors and varieties of feminism that I'm going to be talking about will make sense in context as we go forward. Now, feminist critiques of science can range across a variety of different perspectives. So starting with feminist critiques of the history of science. When you look at the history of science, it's not hard to see patterns in ways in which women have been oppressed using tools that have been developed by science. And this starts all the way back with Aristotle. Aristotle said some terribly, terribly sexist things about women. He said, for example, that women are incomplete men. He said that in the womb, all fetuses are striving to become men, and the ones that come out as women are the ones that just don't quite make it. He says that women are incomplete men. It's really egregiously sexist stuff, and because Aristotle sets the stage for so much of Western intellectual history, that sexism really is sort of adopted by a whole host of different perspectives, even ones that are sort of, broadly speaking, scientific. There's also, of course, political dimensions to this. There has been many different ways in which political barriers have been erected in ways that unfairly exclude women from science. And now, again, some of this sometimes has been explicit. Other times it's implicit. Sometimes it's quite visible. Other times it's invisible. A couple of examples here. It's oftentimes been the case that women have been rejected from access to scientific education, to getting postgraduate degrees in science because of institutionalized sexism. They often will suffer from sexual harassment in laboratories, which have something notorious of a bit of a bro culture to them. They can get excluded from getting grants, again, not for any legitimate reason, but simply because the grant-giving institutions have this sort of male bias behind them. Again, this is just sort of a brief gloss, but you can sort of get a general idea of what's going on here. My particular interest, of course, are going to be the philosophical themes. Now, you can take a look at sort of specific sciences such as biology or economics, and you can sort of, again, when you look at the ways in which these the institutional sides of these things are structured, they oftentimes will exclude the perspectives that women bring to bear on these subjects. And it's oftentimes only been in recent years or recent decades where these disciplines have started to make an effort to try to actively include female perspectives, feminist perspectives, in a way that sort of broadens and in many ways enriches these disciplines. But even sort of, if you take a broader look than just specific sciences, the ways in which intellectual history has characterized the nature of science, has characterized the nature of reason, what it means to know things and so forth, these things are often developed by men and reflect a distinctively male bias. Again, it's worth noting here, for the obvious fact, that I'm a man, and that's my primary textbook is also, for this class, has been written by a man, Peter Godfrey Smith. And most of the historians of philosophy and historians of science and philosophers of science that I've been looking at have been men. Most of the examples in science that I've used have been men. Now, to a certain extent, of course, this is reflecting of the fact that, historically speaking, philosophy and science and history are endeavors that are principally engaged in by men. But that just sort of gives rise to the question why that is the case. Why hasn't there been more buy-in from women in science? This is the kind of thing that feminist critiques of science want to draw our attention to. Now, there is, I think, a moral claim that falls out of this, and that is that these kinds of institutional and exclusions of women have been bad not just for women, but for science and for society at large. If we believe that science is something that improves the quality of life for people in general, if we think that it's important to try to understand the world as richly as possible, we're going to want as many different perspectives as we can get, and that's going to include making sure that women are included in the conversation about science and, of course, about the philosophy of science as well. I want to turn to a specific text here to give an illustration of what I mean by this. This comes from the Australian philosopher Genevieve Lloyd in her book The Man of Reason, which is a bristling critique of intellectual history, both philosophy and science, into how it is that men have framed what it means to know things, what it means to believe things, what it means to be rational and reasonable. She starts with Plato and moves on to Aristotle, and gives one of the just most amazing analyses of Francis Bacon that I've ever read. And these giants of intellectual history have left an imprint on both philosophers and on scientists. So again, Francis Bacon, remember, who's one of the people who first pioneered the idea of the scientific method. He's very famous for his claim that knowledge is power. And when you take a sort of a broader look at the context in which he says that, he has a whole sort of host of language, which, again, I will fully admit, when I first read Bacon, I did not notice. But when when I read Bacon through Lloyd's eyes, suddenly the language that Bacon uses starts to become really, really uncomfortable in a lot of ways. He talks, for example, about how, again, the purpose of power, the purpose of knowledge, rather, is to allow us to control Mother Nature. That we must hold her down and wrench her secrets from her breast and stuff like that. And I kid you not, it really actually kind of sounds something like a rape fantasy that Bacon is engaging in when he describes how it is that science should relate to again, Mother Nature. It's actually quite disturbing in a lot of ways. Now, underlying this, Lloyd draws our attention to there's sort of a standard juxtaposition between the nature of reason and the nature of emotion. Emotions, again, since at least as far back as Plato, have gotten a fairly bad rap for a lot of philosophers. They're sort of, it's seen as corrosive to good reason. This is in the rationalist tradition in particular. People like Plato and René Descartes and Immanuel Kant, they all sort of present this idea that pure reason, true reason, is reason that's free from emotion. And of course, it's kind of an armchair quotidian observation at this point to say that reason is often considered to be the trait that's most associated with men, whereas women are considered to be much more emotional. Now, a case perhaps could be made that there actually is some truth to this. I'm not suggesting that it's fundamentally false. Again, the point here simply is to recognize that when this assumption goes unquestioned, when it goes uncritically analyzed about how it is that men relate to reason and women relate to emotion, and vice versa, how women relate to reason and how men relate to emotion, it starts creating stereotypes, and it starts making us think about the nature of men and the nature of women and the nature of reason and the nature of emotion in narrow ways. And we fail to sort of understand that we lose something when we look at the world through this very myopic lens. And this is a lens which really has dominated Western intellectual thought for about 2,000 years. And I think that we're just now, just in the last few decades even, starting to realize how fundamentally mistaken this view about the nature of reason and emotion is. Now, I want to give a quick digression here. I want to step outside again to put this point in a little bit more context. Again, since antiquity, we've had this view again about the nature of reason and emotion. Plato, Descartes, and Kant, they disparaged emotions. It was corrosive of good reason. And in fact, to this day, there is something called an appeal to emotion, which is typically thought to be a logical fallacy. When you invoke emotions, you're stepping outside of dispassionate reason, and that means that you're not thinking clearly. Now, in fairness, yes, in many contexts, an appeal to emotion is a fallacy. But I think it's pretty clear, and I think we're starting to understand this better now, that it's not always a fallacy, that emotion actually plays a central role in good reasoning. And some of the best evidence from this actually comes from contemporary neuroscience. Modern neuroscience has started to show that what we typically think of as the emotional subsystems in the human brain are actually integral for the proper functioning of what we typically think of as reason, what we typically think of as the rational brain. And probably the most famous case of this comes from Phineas Gage, who was probably one of the most famous case studies in the history of neuroscience. Phineas Gage suffered a traumatic brain injury to his dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. This is a reconstructed picture of him of an iron bar blew through the front of his skull. And he survived this, and then over the course of the rest of his life, his personality changed dramatically, and he was unable to, he was able to do things like basic mathematics reasonably well, but he had incredible difficulty making simple decisions. He became frustrated very easily, and it became basically impossible for him to engage in a lot of everyday tasks, things that we typically think of as rational, like making a decision about when to make an appointment, for example. It became basically incredibly difficult for Gage to make these sort of basic decisions. In short, the parts of his brain that were responsible for integrating reason and emotion were just irreparably damaged. And what this sort of shows is that it's a mistake neurophysiologically to think of reason and emotion as fundamentally different things. These two things are deeply entwined. Now, so again, this picture of basic rational decision making as not being a purely rational process, but rather being sort of deeply intercut with emotions, is something which, again, we understand very well from contemporary fMRI research. The person actually who probably did the most about this is the neuroscientist Antonio Damasio, and his book Descartes' Error. He talks in detail about a patient of his who goes by the pseudonym of Elliot. And he had a brain damage in the exact same place that Phineas Gage did. And Elliot was incredibly difficult for Damasio and other scientists and therapists to work with, because, again, you would ask him to make a simple decision, for example, about when to come in for his next appointment. And it's a kind of decision that someone like you or me, presumably, would be able to make in a space of about maybe 10, 15, maybe 30 seconds if we really had to think about it. But Elliot would sit there for literally hours debating back and forth, trying to make this simple decision, trying to weigh out every single decision point that was to be made, every single point in favor of this date versus that date. And again, what it sort of seems, again, that what Damasio says is that if we're left just to pure reason in some sort of Mr. Spock-like fashion, a lot of decisions can never be made because there aren't rational basis for making a lot of decisions. We need emotions to sort of break the gridlock. Now, this is going to have, I think, an important bearing on science in many, many different ways. Now, not the least of which, of course, is the scientific study of the emotions. I've quoted in this course several times before Albert Einstein's judgment that he knew that relativity had to be true, quote, because it was so beautiful. And this is something that I've sort of stressed and underlined because it seems very, very atypical for scientists. We typically think of scientists as following evidence, not adhering to aesthetic concerns. But Kuhn and Feyerabend both have sort of drawn our attention to the ways in which personal factors actually can make a difference when it comes in certain contexts to deciding between one theory or another in certain contexts. Now, how we feel about a theory actually can, and frankly, according to Kuhn and Feyerabend, should make a difference when it comes to science. And cases like Eliot's sort of show us that we do need these kinds of emotional systems to break this sort of deadlock. Now, theory is always determined by evidence. This has been a point that we've made several times before. There's always going to be multiple theories that are compatible with any particular set of evidence that you get, any amount of data, no matter what you present. And this really is going to actually underscore things in a very, very important way about how, again, we think about what it means to be a scientist in the rational sense of the word. Okay, so going back to feminism now, let's take a concrete case study when it comes to primatology. This is something that Peter Godfrey Smith uses as an example very, very well. For much of the history of primatology, this was a male-dominated science, the way most scientific fields have been male-dominated. And a lack of a female perspective in primatology actually seriously hindered progress in understanding primate behavior. Now, again, primatology is something that goes back at least as far as the Victorian era in England, and the sort of the men who were sort of pioneers in primatology did some really impressive and amazing work. They developed the field in important ways, but they also took a variety of presuppositions, again, that were, in particular to men, but more in particular still to men from the Victorian era, about what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, and they imposed these presuppositions, these very, very clear sort of Victorian suppositions on the primates that they were studying. And so, for example, male primatologists tended to assume that females were sexually passive, that men were the aggressors, that male primates would choose their mates, and they had sort of the sexual authority, and women just sort of had to submit to the sexual authority of men. Of male primates. Suffice to say, this is true in certain species, in certain areas, but simply not true in others. There's actually a wide variety of sexual power dynamics in various different species of primates. And because men simply expected to see male primates take charge and females be submissive, that's all that they saw. And it wasn't really until like the 1960s and then in the 1970s where women like Diane Fossey and Jane Goodall started sort of coming into prominence in various aspects of primatology, that this started to get challenged. Now, it's not hard to sort of see how this kind of misperception about the nature of gender roles and how certain attitudes about traditional gender roles, which are more likely to be prevalent in not just Victorian perspectives, but from a certain sort of male perspective, is going to sort of skew how people look at non-human primates. And again, it's not just when it comes to sexual behavior. It's when it comes to a wide variety of behaviors, including again, tribal hierarchies and sort of how power dynamics are shared, how child-rearing responsibilities are shared, how food distribution is governed. Gender in primate cultures cuts across a wide variety of things in much the same way that it cuts across a wide variety of things in human cultures. And when you have your study dominated exclusively by men, it sort of makes perfect sense that there's going to be some things that you miss. In the same way, if the field had been dominated entirely by women, there would be things that women would miss. Okay, I don't have an example time to go into a whole host of other illustrations here, but I want to at least mention in passing a couple of other illustrations where these kinds of male bias have blinded scientists to important aspects of their fields. So a closely related discipline to primatology, of course, is anthropology. There was a presumption that men in tribal societies would be the hunters, even the gatherers, whereas women would stay home and raise children. Now, again, this is of course true in certain cultures, in certain tribes, but when you sort of take that presumption on, which many male anthropologists did in the early days of the field, then you can be blinded and miss that there actually is a wide variety of different gender dynamics in different tribes in different parts of the world. And if you're not, you're sort of attending to that critically, if you just sort of assume that general stamp that men are the providers and women are the protectors of children and the raisers of children, you miss the incredible diversity of human culture that you get out there. Embryology suffered a pretty serious gendered embarrassment. I think it was in I can't remember if it was the 70s or the 90s, but somewhere in there. There had been this sort of assumption that the sperm swim to the egg and then they penetrate the egg. And again, read sort of early descriptions of this. Again, it's filled with this again, sort of very sort of sexist language. But in a closer examination, again, I think it was in the 90s, sort of recognized that actually it doesn't quite work that way at all. When you actually look at the sort of closely at the sort of various sort of chemical dance that goes on between the sperm and the egg, it actually looks a little bit more like the egg actually is the one that's actually doing the choosing, so to speak. The egg actually is testing the sperm to see which ones are sort of viable and so forth in various ways, and it opens up, as it were, and allows a sperm to sort of to enter into it. So the egg isn't just sort of some damsel in distress that's waiting for the sperm to come along. The egg actually is doing the selecting. In economics, one serious oversight in economics for a long history of time in the discipline only sort of looked at paying labor as work. Labor in which people get paid, that's what counts as real labor. Labor that's voluntary, labor that's sort of part of a social exchange, wasn't considered to be real labor. And this ignores the tremendous amount of labor in culture that's done by, for example, housewives. A man has a job, whereas a woman doesn't have a job. A man goes out and earns money, whereas the woman spends time, again, raising the kids, cleaning the house. That's not labor, according to a lot of traditional labor economics. And that bias leaves out a tremendous amount of actual work that human beings do because it doesn't count them, because it's not seeing money exchanged. In psychology, I think Sigmund Freud is probably in a field of all on his own when it comes to incredible gender bias, his belief about the phallic stage of development in infants, and perhaps there's no more notorious example of terrible gender bias in a science than the ridiculous idea of penis envy, which I'm not even going to say any more about that because that's just, it speaks for itself. In the history of medicine and anatomy, male perspectives were harmful in many ways to women in scientific development. The notion of hysteria, female hysteria, is something that has been written about to some extent. The rest cure was taken for a very long time as an actual cure for postpartum depression. It basically involved telling women to just sit in a bed all day without any kind of stimulation, and that will allow for the passing of postpartum depression. And a lot of women were basically just driven insane by this incredibly cruel practice. And it wasn't until a fiction writer, Elizabeth Perkins Gilman, wrote a story called The Yellow Wallpaper, which is a marvelous story, which I recommend to all of you, in which her character literally went insane after being put on the rest cure. And then after the story was published, she gave it to her obstetrician, who read it and recognized what a terrible thing he did to her. He prescribed the rest cure to her, and he actually started sort of joining on a campaign to abolish the rest cure, and thankfully it was. So again, this is an example where, because doctors weren't listening to their patients, they weren't listening to women, they had this assumption about what women were going through, and they didn't actually trust them. And then, of course, again, in anatomy, the discovery of the G-spot and the nature of female orgasm is something that was, people were quite skeptical about, but for a long time, because sexology was for so long dominated by male scientists. Now, I could give more examples talking about archaeology and history and cognitive science, but I hope this sort of drives the point home. When you start looking at these disciplines from a feminist perspective, from a woman's perspective, you start to see how the lack of female representation has been incredibly detrimental to these disciplines.